The barn doors creaked open, and Harold Whittaker had to grab the doorframe to keep his knees from buckling. The seller, a tired man in his 50s named Eric, gestured at the dust-covered Jeep with the casual indifference of someone clearing out old furniture before the snow came. "She doesn't run, hasn't turned over since Carter was president. 800 cash and she's yours, mister." Harold didn't answer. He walked one slow lap around the Jeep, leaning hard on his oak cane, and when he reached the rear panel he lowered himself to one knee with great difficulty and ran his thumb across a faded white stencil under the spare tyre mount. He stayed there, motionless, for nearly 2 minutes. When he finally rose, his hand was trembling so badly he had to steady it against the fender. "Son," he said quietly, "put your money back in your wallet and sit down on that workbench, because what I have to tell you about your grandfather, about this Jeep, and about where the two of them were on the morning of June 6th, 1944, is going to change everything you thought you knew about the man who raised your father. If you believe every American who ever served deserves to be remembered by name, type the word honor in the comments before this story goes any further." Harold Whittaker was 78 years old and lived alone in a small ranch house outside of Davenport, Iowa, with a flagpole in the front yard and a rust-coloured pickup that he drove only on Sundays. His wife Margaret had passed in the spring of the year before, and since then his mornings had grown long. He filled them with coffee, with the obituaries, and with the classified ads in newspapers from 3 counties over. His children worried about him quietly. His grandchildren called on Tuesdays. What none of them knew, because Harold had never spoken of it in 58 years of marriage, was that he had landed on Omaha Beach 2 months after his 18th birthday as a replacement driver in the 1st Infantry Division, and that the only reason he had lived to see his 19th was because of a sergeant from West Virginia named Walter Mercer, a man Harold had loved like a father, and a man whose body he had helped carry off that beach on the night of June 7th. Harold had not spoken Walter's name aloud since 1946. He had tried to, many times, and the words had never come. The Craigslist ad had appeared on a Wednesday in late October. Old Army Jeep, been in the barn since the 70s, $800 cash takes it. There was one photograph, blurry and shot from too far away, but Harold had stared at it on his kitchen table for the better part of an hour. Something about the angle of the windshield frame, something about the shape of the rear panel. He told himself he was being foolish. There were thousands of surviving Willys MBs scattered across the Midwest, abandoned in barns and fence rows and the back of body shops. The odds that this one was anything more than another rusted civilian conversion were so small they were not worth the gasoline. He went anyway. He left at dawn on Saturday with a thermos of coffee, a thick envelope of cash he could not really afford to spend, and a feeling in his chest he had not felt since the morning the troop ship had pulled out of Weymouth. The drive took nearly 2 hours through farm country that was already going grey for winter. The corn had been cut. The sky was the flat colour of wet concrete. Harold pulled up the long gravel driveway just past 10 o'clock and parked beside a faded red barn that listed slightly to the south. Eric came out of the farmhouse in a Carhartt jacket and a baseball cap, friendly in the distracted way of a man with too much on his mind. He explained, as they walked toward the barn, that his father had passed in August. The estate had been a mess. There was equipment to sell, fields to lease, a mortgage he had not known about. The Jeep had been sitting in the back of the barn for as long as he could remember, covered by a canvas tarp and a half-century of pigeon droppings. His father had said once that it had belonged to his father, but he had never said much beyond that. Eric did not know if it ran. He did not know if the title was clean. He just wanted the barn empty before the first hard snow. Inside, the smell was straw and motor oil and something colder, something older. Harold's eyes adjusted slowly. The tarp had been pulled back into a heap on the dirt floor, and there, in a shaft of pale sunlight from a gap in the eaves, sat a Willys MB in faded olive-drab, its tyres flat and its canvas top long since rotted away, but its lines unmistakable to any man who had ever ridden in one. Harold made a small sound in the back of his throat. He set down his cane against a hay bale and walked forward as if approaching a sleeping animal. He laid his palm flat on the hood, and the cold of the metal travelled up his arm and into a place inside him that he had spent 6 decades trying to keep locked. He walked the Jeep slowly. He looked at the bumperettes. He looked at the Pioneer tools clamped to the side. He looked at the jerrycan bracket and the spade and the patched bullet hole in the left rear fender that someone had filled with body putty in the 1950s. Eric stood near the door, chewing a toothpick, watching this strange old man circle his junk with an intensity he didn't understand. Harold stopped at the rear of the Jeep. He stared at the spare tyre mount. Then he lowered himself to one knee, slowly and painfully, and brushed away the dust under the mount with the side of his hand. The stencil was small. It was faded. It was 3 letters, 4 numbers, and a date. And Harold Whittaker, who had not cried at his wife's funeral and had not cried at his father's, began to weep in a barn in Lynn County, Iowa, with his hand pressed flat against a piece of stamped sheet metal that had been to hell and back before Eric's father was even born. He did not move for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet Eric had to step closer to hear him. "Boy, what was your grandfather's name?" Eric blinked. "Walter, sir. Walter Mercer. He passed in 81 before I was born. Why? Did you know him?" Harold did not answer right away. He pulled an old leather wallet from his back pocket, opened it with shaking fingers, and slid out a small black and white photograph that had been folded so many times the creases had become soft. He handed it up to Eric without looking at him. The photograph showed 2 soldiers leaning against the hood of a Jeep, helmets tipped back, grinning at the camera. The taller one had his arm around the shoulders of the shorter one, who looked like he was about 16 years old. On the back, in pencil that had nearly worn away, someone had written, "Walton the Kid, England, May 44. Eric's mouth opened. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the old man kneeling in his father's barn. He looked at the photograph again. "Sir," he said, and his voice had gone strange. "Sir, that's you." Harold nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "That's me, and that man with his arm around me is your grandfather, and this Jeep, Eric, is the same Jeep we are looking at right now. The number under the spare matches the number on the hood. It matches the number I memorized in 1944 because your grandfather made me memorize it. He said if anything ever happened to him, I was to write to his wife and tell her exactly which Jeep he had been driving so she would know it had been him and not some stranger. He made me repeat it back to him every morning for 3 weeks before we shipped out. I never forgot it. I have not said it out loud in 60 years, but I have not forgotten 1 digit of it. Not one." Eric sat down hard on the workbench. The toothpick fell out of his mouth. Harold was still on one knee. He kept his hand on the stencil as if he were afraid it would disappear if he let go. "Your grandfather drove this Jeep off a Higgins boat at Omaha Beach at 7:14 in the morning on the 6th of June, 1944. The water was up to the dashboard. The man in the passenger seat was killed before they reached the shingle. Your grandfather drove forward anyway, because that was his job, and because there were wounded men on the beach who needed evacuation, and he made 14 runs from the bluff to the aid station that day in this Jeep. 14. I counted. I was a runner that day. I saw him every time he came back. The fender there, that hole someone filled in, that was a piece of shrapnel from a mortar round that landed 20 feet from him at maybe 9 in the morning. It went through the fender and into the radiator, and he kept driving anyway with steam coming up in his face because the boy in the back seat had a sucking chest wound and there wasn't time to stop. He paused. He breathed. The barn was very quiet. A pigeon moved somewhere in the rafters. Your grandfather did not come home from that war the way they tell you in the movies. He came home with a piece of metal in his lung that the doctors decided was too close to the aorta to remove. He came home with nightmares that never stopped. He came home and bought this farm with the GI Bill and never told anyone what he had done because he did not believe he had done anything special. He bought this Jeep at a surplus auction in Cedar Rapids in 1947 because he recognized the number, because somebody had stenciled the date he landed on the back of it as a kind of joke, and because he could not stand the idea of it being parted out for scrap. He drove it on this farm for 25 years, and then one day in the early 70s he parked it in this barn and he covered it with a tarp and he never started it again. I imagine he could not bear to. I imagine every time he sat in that seat, he saw the boys he could not save. I have sat in a great many chairs in my life, son, that I could not bear to sit in twice. Eric was crying now, openly, without seeming to realize it. He kept looking at the photograph and then at the Jeep and then at Harold. "He never told us," he said. "He never told my dad. My dad died not knowing any of this." Harold nodded slowly. "I know. Men like your grandfather did not tell. They came home, and they raised their families, and they paid their taxes, and they took the worst day of the 20th century to their graves with them because they did not want their children to have to carry it. That was the gift they gave us, Eric. The silence was the gift. But you are old enough now, and your children will be old enough soon, and somebody has to remember. So I'm going to tell you everything I remember about Walter Mercer, every single thing, and I'm going to do it because he saved my life on that beach, and I owe him a debt I have spent 60 years trying to figure out how to pay. Harold did not buy the Jeep that morning. He told Eric to keep it. He told him that no amount of money could change what that Jeep was, and that it did not belong in a museum or in some collector's heated garage in Connecticut. It belonged on the farm where Walter Mercer had parked it, and it belonged to Walter Mercer's grandson, and one day it would belong to Walter Mercer's great-grandchildren, and they would know, every one of them, exactly what their blood had done on a beach in Normandy when the world was ending. Harold stayed for lunch, he stayed for supper. He stayed until almost 10 o'clock that night, sitting at Eric's kitchen table, telling stories that had been buried in his chest since 1944. Eric's wife took notes on a yellow legal pad. Their teenage son sat on the floor and listened without saying a word. Harold drove home through the dark. He cried twice on the highway, and he was not ashamed of it. When he got back to his ranch house in Davenport, he walked out to the flagpole in his front yard, and he stood at attention in the cold, and he saluted slowly, the way a young man had once been taught to salute by a sergeant from West Virginia named Walter Mercer. He held the salute for a long time. The wind moved the flag above his head. Somewhere inside the house, a clock ticked. In the spring, Eric's son refurbished the Jeep with help from a local restoration club. They did not repaint it. They left the original olive-drab. They left the patched fender and the faded stencil. The Jeep now sits in a small museum building that Eric had built on the corner of the property, beside a copy of Walter Mercer's discharge papers and the photograph from England in May of 1944, and a brass plaque with the names of every man Harold could remember from their company, 14 of whom did not come home. School groups visit on Tuesdays. Harold drives down for the anniversary every June. He is 81 now. He stands a little less straight than he used to, but he stands. If this story moved you, if you believe the silent generation of veterans who came home and never spoke of what they had done deserve to be remembered before the last of them is gone, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. We tell these stories so that men like Walter Mercer and the boys he saved are not forgotten. Type their names in the comments. Tell us about your grandfather, your father, your uncle. We read everyone, and we remember. Because someone has to